Well, welcome. I'm not sure if we have, oh yeah, the participants are starting to appear other than the panelists. So my name is Paul Cooney. I work with IRPI. I'm part of the steering committee, but I'm currently a professor at the Catholic University in Quito, Ecuador. We're going to have a slight change in the order of our presentations to accommodate Srishti Yadav, who is in India at present. So she will be starting out with a discussion of towards a unified Marxist conception of contemporary petty commodity production. This will be followed by a presentation of Avraham Baranes and Timothy Hazen from Elmhurst University on regional intergovernmental organization response to COVID-19, a neoliberal entrenchment or progressive opportunity. Thirdly will be myself presenting passive development in the Southern Cone, deindustrialization, reprimarization in Argentina and Brazil, and their social environmental impacts. Lastly, we will have a presentation by Alejandro Garay from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Extractive Capitalism, the Political Economy of Extractive Foreign Direct Investment in Peru. So without any further ado, I will pass the virtual microphone to Srishti. Let's see that if you can, you have a PowerPoint, I assume. See if you can. It's opening up. Very good. Okay. So you have, as in each of the presentations, 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. And it's my second time presenting at IRPI at the ASAS. So looking forward to an engaging session. Let me begin with my presentation for today. So this is essentially a review paper that is trying to look at three veins of contributions on petty commodity production, on contemporary petty commodity production within Marxian political economy, and with special reference to the Indian economy. The three contributions that I'm going to be looking at are by Henry Bernstein, Kalyan Sanyal, and Barbara Harris-White. So before I get into these three contributions and compare them, just a little bit on why petty commodity production. So I mean, the aim is it's essentially rooted in the pattern of capitalist development in the Indian economy particularly since the 1980s, where we have seen constrained structural transformation, or what has also been termed a premature deindustrialization, where the industrial sector has sort of stagnated to about 30% of the GDP, and since has started to fall. And much of the growth, particularly after 1991, when the Indian economy liberalized, economic growth has largely come from the services sector. And this entire trajectory has also been marked by a rise of informality, right? And again, this is not unique to the Indian economy. This is an experience which can be sort of observed over a number of other economies in the global south, but I'm concentrating on India today. Informality. So the big numbers, just to keep the question in mind, 93% of employment in the Indian economy is informal, 99% in agriculture, and about 70% in the non-agricultural sectors. What does informality mean? Typically, informality within the organized enterprises, so organized enterprises which are sort of legally recognized, they pay taxes, they're bound by labor laws, etc. There is rising informality within the organized sector, such that half the employment that the organized sector generates is also informal now. And then there is the large unorganized sector, which is not bound by sort of legal constraints over labor laws, environmental laws, etc. This unorganized sector, 84% of the employment, and a large part of the unorganized sector is own account enterprises. So self-employed or enterprises that only rely on family labor, that do not hire any labor. This is 87% of the non-agricultural unorganized sector in India. And what's interesting about this particular category is that there is very little linkage with the organized sector in the form of putting out arrangements, outsourcing, etc. So this is really the self-employed in India, 56% of the workforce. We are really looking at a category which does not hire labor and is also doesn't have any overt relationship with large capital. Why is this interesting, or why is this a question worth pursuing? Because essentially the polar duality between capital and proletarianized labor does not capture the lived realities of a vast section, more than 50% of the Indian working masses, right? So we're looking at a self-employment which has no labor hiring, no direct relationship with capital, and which is here to stay, right? That's one of the core sort of recognitions about contemporary PCP. It's here to stay. It's not a transitory form. So what I'm going to do now is to briefly go over the conceptualizations of Henry Bernstein, Kalyan Sanyal, and Barbara Harris-White, and try to offer some kind of a comparison between these three. So starting with Bernstein, oldest conceptualization out of these three. According to Bernstein, PCP is the contradictory combination of the class places of capital and labor, both of which have their own circuits, their own disciplines of reproduction. So PCP essentially embodies both capital and labor. So it is very much a part of capitalism. This is real world capitalism. That's what Bernstein says. The producer is both the owner of means of production and the source of labor, along with unpaid family members. As capital, the circuit is to reproduce at the same scale and potentially to grow. So accumulate in order to grow. As labor, the circuit or the discipline is to maintain the social and necessary standard of consumption or subsistence. And these two circuits are often in conflict with each other. So according to Bernstein, PCP is, I'm using that shorthand for petty commodity production, PCP is regulated by the same laws as all other enterprises. So there is nothing essentially unique about PCP. It is regulated by the same laws. Capitalism is understood as generalized commodity production, which is founded on the contradiction between capital and wage laborers. So PCP is also to be understood through this same contradiction between capital and labor. And Bernstein's contribution, though, which is interesting and which has influenced a number of other scholars, is that we should not confuse phenomenal form and essence when thinking about whether an economic formation or even an individual enterprise is capitalist or not. We have to not confuse form and essence. There can be a multiplicity of forms in terms of relations of production, but that the essence is what we have to locate. And that for PCP in particular, he says the essence cannot be essentially separated from the circuits of capital and labor. And so the primary tendency that he locates for PCP is the tendency of differentiation, either up as capital proper, a petty capitalism, what he would call, or down as proletarianized labor. But that, so he says that that doesn't always need to manifest, but the tendency exists. And why it does not manifest can only be ascertained by looking at the concrete conditions. So there is no theoretical sort of prerequisite for why differentiation might not happen. So Bernstein has really started out by trying to conceptualize a non-transitory, non-functionalist. There is no economic function of PCP for capitalism as such. A non-essentialist, there is no distinct essence to it either. And a non-articulationist conception of PCP. So PCP is real world micro-capitalism. PCP is not an exploited class. There are class relations within PCP. So it rests on unpaid household family labor, but the class places of capital and labor can be unequally distributed within the household. So that can be by gender or by generation. So essentially what he's trying to highlight is exploitative relations within the PCP unit rather than between PCP and large capital as such. The second theorization by Kalyan Sanyal is almost the polar opposite of Bernstein's. For Sanyal, contemporary PCP is a Chayanovian outside of capital. So family labor-based commodity production, very much embedded in commodity production, but the logic of operation of these economic units is survival or subsistence. It is not accumulation per se. For Sanyal, PCP is not an economic necessity for capitalism, but it plays a political and ideological function because he says that post-colonial capital does not have the capacity to absorb surplus populations. So PCP emerges, the space of the need economy, what he calls, that is the sphere where essentially all of those excluded from capital find a space for survival and reproduction. So he does not call the need economy PCP because he wants to eschew the transitory transition connotation, which is traditionally associated with PCP. Sanyal says that there is a distinct circuit to the need economy, which looks very much like the circuit of capital, but the difference is that, so you start out with money, purchase means of production from the market, produce commodities which are sold on the market for M prime, but the difference between M prime and M is not necessarily going back into the production circuit, that is going to fulfill the consumption needs of the household, of the producing unit. So any surplus that is generated, even if it is invested in production, is essentially oriented towards subsistence or improving subsistence levels. Distribution is also not shaped by market relations as such, but through kinship and communal relations. So output surplus would be shared within the household. The average product would be shared. This is the Chayanovian logic. And Sanyal also emphasizes there with need economy, there is no, because it's oriented towards survival, there is no distinction between the realm of production and the realm of reproduction. So this is also, I mean, it's complemented by the empirical findings that the majority of own account enterprises, self-employed enterprises are run out of the household. 81% are run out of the household. 45% of them are run by women, who are also obviously bear the burden of social reproduction as well. So the distinction between life processes and production processes disappears in the need economy. So for Sanyal, therefore, the need economy, contemporary PCP, is distinct from capitalist production. The need economy is not necessarily exploited by capital, it's excluded by capital. So it is the space of those who have been excluded by capital. And what's important to remember is that for Sanyal, capitalism is essentially reduced to the duality between capital and labor. So production relations are capitalist if the capitalist has the monopoly over means of production and the laborer is doubly free, employed for wage work by the capitalist to produce commodities which are sold on the market. Lastly, the third conception is by Barbara Harris White. This is somewhere in the middle of Bernstein and Sanyal's conceptions. So she starts out with the same starting point as Bernstein, in that PCP is economic activity which combines capital and labor in sort of gendered divisions within the household. It is marked by the dialectic between exploitation and accumulation. But the difference is that Harris White recognizes that the theoretical tendency for differentiation does not materialize, and the empirical reality actually is that PCP grows by multiplication, not by concentration and centralization. So it tends to, there's a process of mitosis almost happening. It doesn't build up into petty capitalism proper most of the time. And she also emphasizes the various exploitative relationships in which PCP is embedded. So self-exploitation obviously is the first. PCP produces cheap commodities because family labor is unpaid or extremely underpaid. And there is a transfer of surplus value happening to the consumer through the low prices. PCP also, through the putting out linkages with apex capital, what she calls large capital, it contributes to cheapening of labor and to subsidization of wages. Surplus is also extracted from PCP through rent, interest, and commodity markets, so raw material markets, for example. And I mean, it also helps essentially reduce costs of production for apex capital by helping offload labor costs, environmental regulation costs, gives greater flexibility, etc. So essentially, PCP is marked by the extraction of absolute surplus value, not relative surplus value, which is why it's considered to be formal subsumption, of labor under capital, but non-transitory. She emphasizes that quite a bit. So Barbara Harris White's conception takes PCP as capitalist relations, but introduces an essential logic to it, which does not exist in Bernstein's conception. So just putting all of them together, what we can see, so the similarity or the common ground for Bernstein and Harris-White is that PCP is part of the ensemble of capitalist relations. It is the contradictory combination of labor and capital. So it runs, it has both the circuits, both the disciplines. But Harris-White introduces an essential logic to PCP. She recognizes that multiplication is the primary tendency for growth and not differentiation. And I mean, also emphasizes that it is embedded in various exploitative relationships. So what Harris-White has in common with Sanyal is the essential reality, it's self-exploitation. So some elements of Chayanovian logic, but embedded within capitalist relations. The major sort of pitfall of Sanyal's argument is the fact that he equates capitalist relations with the duality between capital and labor. And this has been critiqued on, I mean, it can be critiqued on a number of levels. Obfuscating form and essence, ideal typification of capitalist relations, not able to discern between the various levels of abstraction in Marx's work, etc., etc. So there's common ground between Bernstein Harris-White and Harris-White Sanyal, and it seems like Harris-White's work has got the most descriptive power, but not the theoretical sharpness, of course, of either of the other two. But still, in my opinion, it has the greatest potential for sort of being able to provide new sort of theoretical pathways for understanding PCP. And then the big question, essentially, which we have to grapple with, is that if PCP has the logic of multiplication and not differentiation, what does it mean for an economy which is dominated by PCP? So where the bulk of the economic units are growing by multiplication and do not have the tendency for concentration and centralization. I think that's the big question ahead of us now. That's where I'll end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Shrishti, especially Menti, for staying within the time limit. So I will now turn to the presentation by Abraham Baranes and Timothy Hazen. So you guys can begin. Just in general, any questions, we are deferring till the question and answer time. If there's something very specific, you could send something in the chat. Okay, you can go ahead, Abraham and Timothy.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. Our research has focused, you'll note first off the title change, just a small one, focusing on the impact of neoliberalism on this concept of bureaucratic autonomy, which we'll talk about in our presentation. Our research is focused primarily on how regional intergovernmental organizations responded to COVID-19 and what factors allowed them to respond, or in certain cases actually limited the way in which they respond. And more specifically, what we're really interested in is in how the dominance of neoliberalism as an institutional constraint has impacted the bureaucratic autonomy of regional intergovernmental organizations, regional IGOs. And what we've found is that under neoliberalism, bureaucratic autonomy is really the autonomy of financing, which helps contribute, we argue, to the spread and dominance of neoliberalism in general. And this has important implications for crisis management theory, especially as crises are increasingly transboundary in nature. So the framework within which we are working is this concept of crisis management theory coming from political science. A crisis in general is an event that breaks down the framework that legitimizes pre-existing socio-political order and generates conditions of deep uncertainty. So actual crisis management has to occur under these conditions. And as we've seen in previous research, the most important factors in successful crisis management are institutions that are resilient. And this resilience has to be improved upon in non-crisis times. This is done by preparing first responders, strengthening local institutions, creating systems through which information and coordination can occur, and the like. Basically, a lot of very planned action that needs to occur in non-crisis times in order to prepare an organization for managing a crisis. Now, a complication of modern crises is the transboundariness of the crisis. And a transboundary crisis is that which affects multiple jurisdictions, undermines the functioning of various policy sectors and critical infrastructures, escalates rapidly, and morphs along the way. And these crises generally cross political boundaries, so it's not necessarily clear who has the authority to respond. And they also don't have clearly demarcated beginnings and ends. So they require much more sustained responses and different strategies for managing them. Now, in this paper, we use the concept of bureaucratic autonomy as discussed by Bauer and Egge to understand the different factors that impact the ability for an organization to react and respond to crises. Organizations with high levels of bureaucratic autonomy are able to decide how they want to respond, which is referred to as autonomy of will, and they have the ability to act after making this decision, which we define as the autonomy of action. Now, prior to developing autonomy of will, an organization must obtain administrative cohesion and administrative differentiation. And these dimensions, as defined by Bauer and Egge, allow the organization to act as its own entity and develop preferences separate from the members of the organization. So in the context of intergovernmental organizations, these would be an organization that fits together and develops preferences separate of what its member states might want to do. Now, prior to developing autonomy of action, the organization then must establish statutory powers and have access and control over its own administrative resources. This ensures that the organization can then act without superior oversight from its member states and actually has the resources necessary to translate its will into action. So one of the things that we discuss in our paper is how under neoliberalism, organizations have to act within the context of this regulatory state in which the job of the public sector is to set parameters for private sector agents rather than directly act themselves. In this way, markets generally become the values and ethics that public sector agents have to follow. As research by Barnett has shown, this leads to the replacement of a society based on mutual obligation with that of a society as a set of voluntary, self-interested exchanges. And the end effect is that crises lead to policymakers separating the population into those who must sacrifice. If we think of in the context of COVID-19, this would be like staying home and teaching on Zoom, for example, and those who are asked to be sacrificed. So the first responders, everyday workers who still have to go and check you out at the grocery store and the like. Now, in the context of crisis management, as Jones and Hamari have shown, is neoliberalism in the non-crisis times weakens the organization's ability to respond to crisis. The state, based on this logic, is able to effectively absolve itself of responsibility for any one specific issue. And then crisis response occurs mainly through these channels that focus on public-private partnerships, liquidity provisioning rather than direct action, and the creation and transformation of incentive structures to get the private sector to respond to the crisis rather than actually responding themselves. So effectively, we can consider neoliberalism in this way as causing organizations, especially public sector organizations, to willingly cede bureaucratic autonomy, which has left them ill-prepared to address crises. So Tim will now discuss how this is seen in regional IGO responses.
All right. Thank you, Avi, and hello, everyone. So yes, we took this theoretical framework and we wanted to examine it through the lens of regional IGOs. There's several reasons for this, both theoretical and practical. From the theoretical standpoint, we felt as if the regional IGOs were a wonderful kind of case study to examine. So for instance, there's research that kind of states that regional IGOs are these bridges that link the global and the local. So kind of in between, the United Nations, the WHO, and also the more kind of local politics or, even politics within a country. So they're well poised to kind of examine what's happening at these more regional levels. Also in regards to the theoretical aspect is we specifically wanted to look at how these secretariats were responding. And so the secretariats is what we focus on within these regional IGOs. One reason for that is the secretariats are a wonderful window into understanding how the organization works. So understanding the intra-organization components, but also the secretariats are significant in picking up on the relationship between the regional IGO and the member states itself. So we thought that that was a very useful aspect. We ultimately wanted to look at a variance of different regional IGOs that represent different geographic areas and also have different mandates. So as you can see here, the 4 selected for this comparative analysis include the African Union, the Asian Development Bank, the European Union, and the Organization of American States. Very diverse groups of IGOs kind of on purpose with different mandates, some wider and some such as the ADB and OAS perhaps narrower. Another reason for this within the literature is that we have noticed that there are quite a few just individual case studies on how a particular organization responded, or maybe research that looked at just Latin America or just Africa or just Europe, et cetera. And so we thought that this would be useful to widen the microscope back a little bit further to get a sense of, making regional comparisons overall. So Avi, I think if you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So to begin with, we want to see what the secretariats did within these organizations. And we'll start with the European Union and the Asian Development Bank. So quite simply is that we noticed that the EU Commission and the ADB Board of Governors were quite active within the last 18 to 24 months within their responses. Particularly the EU was very active with a wide variety of different policy tools that the Commission utilized. So just for instance, even just going on their website, you find hundreds upon hundreds, and I actually tabulated when we were writing the paper, nearly 250 policies that just the EU Commission was operating in regards to COVID-19. These range from a very local to a very international perspective. So for instance, providing EU member states with financial support, providing EU citizens with financial support, but also the EU was extremely active in going beyond the EU borders, providing financial aid direct and indirect to international countries and international individuals overall. So we see numerous initiatives that really demonstrate the autonomy of a will, essentially, of the EU. These initiatives like Next Generation EU, which is, $750 billion, right? $750 billion to member states, which is one of the most ambitious financial packages initiated by the EU. And we also see that they played a leading role within vaccination status. So even not so much on the financial aspect, but even setting the tone of what the vaccination policies would be roughly across the EU borders. Moving on to the ADB, certainly just given the more narrow nature of the organization, it's perhaps not quite as expansive as the EU Commission, but the ADB Board of Governors was also very active. We see tremendous amount of aid that was given towards member states within the last 18 months. You can read some of the numbers here, but the most specific, particularly interesting aspect that we found is that a lot of this was to help aid the member states, whether that was through medical assistance or vaccine, or also, as it will be seen, just to kind of help with projects and loans within these countries overall. So Avi, if you could go to the next slide as well. Thank you. Wonderful. So in contrast, we observed that the African Union Commission and the OAS General Secretariat were less active or less ambitious within their responses. The AU Commission, it should be noted, did have some laudable ambitions. We see here, one of them that I wanted to highlight was AFCOR, the African Task Force of Coronavirus, which was a very innovative project of trying to link the AU Commission with the World Health Organization and also with the recently created African CDC that just serendipitously was created a couple years ago prior to the pandemic. So there were these policies put in place by the African Union to try to help bring the member states together, but this was mostly through information sharing, through health ministers, and also, kind of through different sharing networks overall. As for the OAS, of the 4 regional IGOs that we observed, they were the most modest in their policies. Essentially, what the OAS General Secretariat most notably did was kind of create these reports and disseminate information. So they did not really provide much, specific aid in any aspect, but more the OAS General Secretariat just kind of set up these different platforms. And so one of the notable ones they did here, as you can see here, was the JSWG, which was kind of this inter-American platform of about 13 different organizations. So we noticed a variety of different responses. And so Avi, if you can go to the next slide, this brings us more specifically to this aspect of neoliberalism that Avi nicely highlighted several minutes ago. So what we see within these slides is we wanted to look, okay, where are the neoliberal policies specifically within these organizations' responses? And so most interestingly, what we see within the AU and the OAS is that these 2 organizations kind of intentionally or unintentionally, as we'll get to in our conclusion slides, had to utilize and kind of tap into the private firms to really get some of this financing. So specifically, we see numerous proposals through the AU Commission listed here, the COVID-19 Response Fund of the AU, the African Medical Supplies Platform, which essentially links the AU to private investors and private donations to kind of help facilitate bringing in medical supplies, bringing in testing equipment, bringing in even money to help pay or help member states actually pay their healthcare services and contract tracers within their country. So really needing to tap into the private sector in order to make this possible. The OAS did something similar, perhaps less financial, but we even see the OAS tapping into Silicon Valley, where OAS had numerous kind of online platforms during COVID that linked with Facebook and WhatsApp. And they were opportunities that were for medium-sized firms throughout the American states to kind of link with WhatsApp and Facebook and to get training and to get more education on how these mid-sized firms can pivot to an online commercial platform, since brick and mortar stores were essentially being in difficult situations because of the lockdown orders and because of the pandemic. So we see kind of the private sector having this key role in some of the responses with the AU and the OAS. Avi, if you could please go to the next slide. It should be noted that the EU and the ADB also had many neoliberal responses as well. So we see that the EU Commission worked with numerous pharmaceutical, a list here of ones that we're familiar with. And we even see that the EU was extremely active in being this kind of incentivizing role that provided grant money or award money for all of these private firms as they kind of raced for a vaccine, or they raced for these innovative projects within the COVID-19 era. We see that the EU is kind of dangling these carrots, dangling these incentives for these private firms to try to get access to. We also see that the ADB had a large neoliberal role. Certainly, probably unsurprising, just the neoliberal nature of the organization to begin with, but we specifically see the role that much of the aid and loans that the ADB provided to member states kind of went specifically back in to help, prime the wheels of market activity and to provide liquidity for the market activity. So we see this neoliberal aspect really present in all of the four organizations that we observed. Avi. So I need to move I can't see with my screens here. So overall, what we see, we wanted to just kind of create this very easy to read summary of how we are incorporating Bauer and Egge's concept of autonomy of will and autonomy of action to what we observed across these four regional IGOs. They are listed alphabetically on the left-hand side from African Union to OAS, but to begin with from the narrative and to reiterate from the last previous slides and to make it more explicit, is that we observe that the ADB and the EU both possessed, at least from our observation, high levels of autonomy of will and high levels of autonomy of action. That the EU Commission and the ADB, that if they wanted to pass a policy, that there were very few constraints of those secretariats at least getting those policies on the docket. And not only that, but we also see that because of the high autonomy of action, that these policies were able to be executed and more bluntly, were able to be financed, which in just a few moments, Avi will talk about in more detail. But overall, we see that the EU and the ADB, according to Bauer and Egge's model, we're confident, at least in COVID-19, that these two organizations demonstrated high autonomies of will and high autonomies of action. In contrast, we observed that the African Union had lower levels of autonomy of will and action. In fairness to the AU, it does seem that they have maybe mid-level of autonomy of will recently with COVID-19. There were some ambitious projects originated within the AU Commission. So it's not as if they had these more modest goals. They did have these ambitious goals. But what we observed with the AU is that they were just unable to kind of internally fund them, right? African countries just unfortunately perhaps did not have the means to even fund their own countries or even to provide more contributions to the AU overall. And so this demonstrates that they have a lower level of action and ultimately they had to tap into the private sector. The OAS, we see lower levels of autonomy of will. The General Secretariat doesn't even have that demonstration of the AU's ambition, and certainly they were unable to fund these projects overall. So I see Paul's 2-minute timer, so I'll turn it over to Avi for the last two slides to conclude. And you are muted, Avi.
There we go. Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I want to kind of emphasize the two key observations. If we think of bureaucratic autonomy as really just the ability to act, the ability to respond, for an organization to respond to a crisis in the way it wants to. The lack of bureaucratic autonomy by the African Union and the Organization of American States contributes to the dominance and entrenchment of neoliberalism in the region. These regions become more subservient to neoliberal institutions from other regions in order to actually carry out and respond to the crisis. And we also, if we argue, as I do kind of up at the top of the slide, that if bureaucratic autonomy and specifically the autonomy of action is really just the ability to finance the private sector, then what that does is it continues to reinforce and place banks and central banks in kind of primary roles for crisis management. All sorts of crisis management has to be flushed through financial channels rather than potentially direct action that might work better. So just to quickly conclude, the ability to act is real, or the bureaucratic autonomy really just defines the ability for an organization to respond to a crisis. Neoliberalism has, during a crisis, transformed this autonomy of action to autonomy of finance, while also weakening the ability for organizations to act, given the way in which it tells pre-crisis institutional structures to transform. So our hope is that future research can more closely link these issues between bureaucratic autonomy and neoliberalism, especially as crises become increasingly frequent and increasingly transboundary. And I will stop there.
Okay, thanks, Avraham and Timothy. If there's a question related to the discussion, as I said earlier, we will be having questions and answers after all the presentations. I saw that Mona had a question, but right now we're requesting people to hold off until we get the question answers. So I'm going to turn to my presentation. Everyone can see that okay? Very good. So my presentation is a discussion related to a book that I've just recently published, looking at paths of development in the Southern Cone, concentrating on Argentina and Brazil, and how they've gone through the processes of deindustrialization and reprimarization in recent decades. And I will then be looking at, besides these development trajectories, specifically the issue of accumulation by dispossession, probably rather brief because I don't have that much time. And then the social environmental impacts, be it genocide, deforestation, the problems of climate change, forest fires, and so on. And lastly, I will make some conclusions. So briefly, although most people should probably know, the period we're in currently is neoliberal globalization, and it is dominated by not just transnationals, but the four pillars of neoliberalism, which I quickly identify as the trade liberalization, financial deregulation, privatizations, and the deregulation of workers' rights. In recent decades, basically 40 years since neoliberalism has taken hold, you had a very serious transnationalization of the global economy. And I refer to TCC. This is a concept derived by William Robinson, an important Marxist sociologist, which is a transnational capitalist class. And so it's not that people have member cards, but it's a question of a dominant presence of the interests of transnationals as well as capitalists globally in the first world, more and more in tune with what the the capitalist classes in the periphery attempt to accommodate. In Argentina, Brazil, two of the places where we are associated with neo-developmentalism, and yet I call into question what is the nature of this development path, especially if it's been associated with not only deindustrialization, but with reprimarization of their economies. And that's what I want to look into. But what we need to be very clear about is the role of the World Trade Organization. In my opinion, the World Trade Organization is the most important and powerful institution internationally at present across the globe. Yet it's very invisible. Many people don't even know about it. But the WTO is basically GATT on steroids. And the WTO means all the attempts at industrial policy that dominated from post-World War II through the 70s, if not the early 80s, has been eliminated. You cannot have tariffs that are supportive of nascent industry as you did. You can't have subsidies as you once did. They're not prohibited, they're subject to sanctions. So if Mozambique tries to do something on their own, but China says it's not good for their markets, China takes them to the court or of the WTO. Similarly, if Argentina or a smaller country wants to try and take the US or Europe, their chances of winning is much, much less. The problem is that means that many countries, even those that were industrialized, have to rely on the production of primary goods associated with ground rent. The differential rent that occurs, such as in production of iron in the Brazilian Amazon, is at $15 a ton. It clearly competes by incredibly compared to China at $100 a ton. So that's where Brazil can compete. They can no longer compete in industry. If Ecuador wanted to develop its own health system, sorely lacking as we saw in this COVID crisis, they cannot do so without giving opportunity, equal opportunity, if not improved opportunity, for transnationals in that field. This is a total change. And this means that the rules of the game have changed significantly, and development for me is been postponed until the WTO is broken up or seriously changed. That will be the state of affairs. Turn to Argentina. It had two waves of deindustrialization. First, with the coup in 1976, strongly supported by the IMF and US government. It was one of the three neoliberal experiments. You had Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. The government of Martinez de Oz and the government military government having 30,000 disappeared people. It was a very brutal military dictatorship. And one of the most significant factors was how they wanted to eliminate where workers could organize. You had a huge shift from manufacturing to agro industry. At one time in 1973, 66% of their exports were manufacturing goods. So this idea that it was a closed economy is just rubbish. One has to look at the details and avoid the neoliberal myths. The second wave of deindustrialization took place in the 90s with Menem and Cavallo and the famous convertibility. And these shifts took place both internationally, but also with the role of the OMC, WTO as of 1995 and the Washington Consensus. Just briefly here, we have the manufacturing industry as a percent of GDP. From 1950 to 2019, it had reached a maximum of 29% in 71. It's down to 13%. It was one of the three most industrialized countries of Latin America. That is no longer the case. I had to buy bicycle tubes in the US because I could not find ones that worked well in Argentina, sad to say. In terms of Brazil, which was maybe the most industrialized country in the periphery before South Korea's reaching its apex in the early 80s, the deindustrialization began a little later in 1985. In fact, neoliberalism really didn't begin until 1990. And part of that is a support for a strong state. But between the elimination of tariffs and subsidies, financial deregulation, the huge increases in FDI with the Fernando Enrique Cardoso governments, and incredible levels of privatizations, and the highest interest rates in the world, close to 15 years, where they were the highest, leading to an incredible amount of finance income, finance investment, and extremely overvalued currency. So what happened to Brazil? From having been over 35% of their GNP in manufacturing, it went down to as low as 11% in 2019 and continues downward. Many Brazilians cannot believe this took place because we still think of Brazil as an industrial country. However, the shift to primary production has been astounding. So briefly, the exports overall that have tripled between 1999 and 2009. However, the exports of primary goods grew by 525%. So in the graph I'm about to show, you see the proportion of export goods, of primary goods within the export profile to manufacturing was roughly 3.31. It went to over 1.1 by 2019. The impact is very significant, not just for the Brazilian manufacturing output, but also for productivity. They actually had a decline in productivity, which I couldn't believe, for over 10 years. And besides that, some of your best employment has been eliminated in terms of manufacturing. So here's this graph I just mentioned. I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. Briefly, accumulation by dispossession is an important advance, in my opinion, made by David Harvey in recent decades. In taking comments and evaluation or research by Luxembourg, by Hannah Arendt, is recognizing that the use of legal means, force, pillaging, fraud, and so on, is not something that is only valid for the transition from feudalism to capitalism. It continued through to the present day in the 21st century. The difference is you don't always have the interest of the state wanting to obtain wage laborers because they're often already there. What you have is that a strong interest for either the soil or the subsoil in terms of exploiting it for, say, mining, soy, and so on. So very briefly, looking at Brazil, you have a strong example of the rubber industry with many aspects that were not established capitalist production, but involved serious amounts of violence as well as fraud and incredible role of companies outside of the Brazilian Amazon. The military government from 64 to 85 was very significant in promoting change in the Amazon, both having migrants from the South, including some of your owners, capitalist owners, The role of the Northeasterns, often trying to escape drought, came into the Amazon, and you had much legal and illegal means, especially force, in a term used called grillage, which actually means producing false property documents. As it turns out, you also had in this period a significant amount of cases of genocide. We assumed that when the dictatorship ended, that would also come to an end. Unfortunately, Bolsonaro, the South American version of Trump, has let that return to being an important and relevant discussion, unfortunately. Turning to issues of the environment, but also other social issues, the main points to be considered that I examine in my book is the deforestation in the Amazon. This is primarily tied to first lumber, cattle, then soy, but also mining and petroleum. Soy is the most profitable compared to cattle and other activities, but it is often, it only is achieved after a certain process of other farmers. Air, water, and soil pollution are relevant, especially in the use of pesticides, especially used for the production of soy, among other items such as palm oil and other agricultural products. Soil erosion is a major problem in all of these activities, and it's very important the role of dams. Mining is extremely electricity intensive. So when you deal with the level of mega mining, which is a term that has been used in Latin America for some time, these dams have another major problem in terms of their impact on biodiversity, as well as social conflicts. Lastly, you have problems of petroleum and biofuels. Some of your defenders of green capitalism will end up pushing for biofuels, but that actually promotes deforestation. Continuing, I can't go into too much more detail given the time constraints. So what I will turn to is a couple images. There's a nice cleared out area in the Amazon in recent years. One big role, if people have questions, I can answer in the question and answer, is the issue of expansion of soy. Soy has been huge in promoting the deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, as well as in other places such as Argentina, among other locations. And there's a very strong domination by your TNCs. They're known as the ABCD, ADM, Cargill, Bunge, and Dreyfus. But in the chemical area, you have the role of Bayer, Monsanto, Atanor, Nedera, and Dow. And the drive for the accumulation by transnationals ends up being what defines development for these countries in recent decades. And this is problematic. The example, some will say, oh, we have employment thanks to transnationals. When you look at the production of soy, in 1,000 hectares employs 15 workers. In the case of cane sugar, it's 350. Citric fruits, 1,300 workers. So you're not having any improvement for employment by having soy production. In fact, there's a nice image of the way we have extremely capital intensive extraction of soy in one of the states of the Amazon. Evidently not very much like a forest. Here we have a nice example of the largest open pit mine, iron pit mine in the world. This is done by Vale, the second largest transnational globally. And they are currently in the production of one that will be 6 times this size. This is in the state of Pará, where I lived for a number of years. Briefly, and I know Alejandro mentioned this in his work, the increase of social conflicts related to mining has increased. It was 284 in 2012. Of course, it vacillates a bit, but Latin America has been where there's been more resistance and conflict because of mining. But of course, Latin America has become the 4th largest destination of mining globally. So this is a major factor. Many countries that did not have mining before are now having it. May not work out with the end of the commodity boom. Couple issues about Brazil. There's the problems of forest fires promoted by Bolsonaro at times in areas of indigenous populations. He's clearly proto-fascist. It's tough to imagine, but he's, I think, worse than Trump. It's really difficult to imagine that, but Bolsonaro, he's out there. And it's, and the thing about the Amazon is the deforestation is not just a danger for Brazil, it's a danger for the planet. The role of the destruction of the forest of the Amazon, which is often cited as the lungs of the planet, clearly impacts the issue of climate change. There's a nice little lively image, although California can compete with these images as well. Briefly, in the current stage, there are very serious structural limitations for the periphery. And part of that is being members of the OMC. At one level, it seems ridiculous, but or the WTO. There's a reason why there's members. I don't have time to go into it, but it has to do with the interests of those in power coincide with the interests of the transnationals. It often is exactly against the interests of the majority of those populations. But we have to avoid, as some friends or colleagues in Brazil and Argentina think, that there can be a return to another ISI, industrialization through importation. There's not an industrial bourgeoisie looking to make class alliances as they did in the past. Very briefly, transition to beyond capitalism, well, I don't expect to see that in my lifetime, but one has to look towards moving towards that. And that requires not a developmentalism that simply accommodates your transnational interests, but instead you have to look for cooperatives and other post-capitalist proposals, even if it's a process of transition. And there must be emphasis on the environment and solutions that do not place profits above the needs and priorities of the people. In this regard, roles of social movements, be it in the environment, be it ecofeminism, be it the indigenous groups such as Leonidas Issa here in Ecuador, there's a need for this and an establishment of resistance globally. Yes, it's a sounding catch-all phrase, but there are some efforts being made, especially by indigenous groups, which is surprising for many, but it's something that has to be continued. Lastly, I'll make a plug for a book of mine that just came out by Palgrave on this exact topic. If you're interested, I can send an email or I can send you the link. The show continues. Thank you. So let me now turn to the next presentation, sorry, by Alejandro. And just for those who came later, after the 4 presentations, we will have the brief comments for each on the different topics and then open it up to the audience for questions and answers. Go ahead, Alejandro.
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to
share screen. You can see it on the bottom.
Yeah.
Green? No?
You guys are having my screen? Not yet.
Let me just, no, it's coming up.
Okay, cool.
There we go.
Okay, so just let me put my timer. I'm not good managing my time, so okay. Thanks for being here today. This is my presentation, and that's the title. I'm going to go very quickly over my presentation. My paper has 2 main goals. First is to provide an alternative conceptual framework in a Marxian tradition for understanding the capitalist and non-capitalist social interaction. And then to try to illuminate the impact of extractive and transnational capital on indigenous peasant communities in the Andes of northern Peru. I'm going to focus in 2 regions of the northern of Peru. This is the outline. I'm not going through this, or I will go in during my presentation. Just to mention that a slightly different version of this paper was already published just a few months ago in a book that was edited by Luis Felipe Rochon and some others. Peru has a long mining tradition. The emergence of capitalist mining is tied to the Spanish colonialism, as we know, and the dispossession of indigenous people from their lands. Massive exports of gold and silver characterized the colonial period. During the 19th century, mining experienced a prolonged stagnation. It partially recovered in the 1870s to decline again in the early 20th century. These are some figures that are coming from the early 18th century through the 21st century. As you can see, the Peruvian economy was characterized by its extractive nature, where agriculture and mining were, during the last 3 centuries, very central to the Peruvian economy. Capital relations were intensified during the early 20th century. Also, a large part of the productive process was still based in non-capitalist productive relations. The hacienda system embodied this complex interaction of capitalist and non-capitalist relations, a system characterized by its large concentrations of land and persistent feudal relations of domination and dependence. This was central for the accumulation of capital and the building of the modern nation state. The interests of the land-owning, agricultural, and mining oligarchy overlapped during this period and will overlap in the 21st century. The social economic transformation of the periphery has been usually discussed within the theoretical confines of development and underdevelopment. Marxist literature in general has emphasized the notions of dependency, modes of production, and imperialism to explain the complex interaction of the capitalist and non-capitalist social formations. Marxist notions of imperialism and primitive accumulation have been playing a central role in those discussions. Just for the sake of the argument, let's take 2 contemporary commentators. Helen Wood, for example, argues that capital's uniqueness lies in its capacity to detach economic from extra-economic power, imposing its hegemony without openly relying on political coercion, violence, or other non-economic forms of power. The subordinated condition of the extra-economic to the economic logic implies that the political logic is completely determined by the economic logic. So as the need for accumulation increases, the nation state responds mechanically to these arguments. And there's a lot of literature working in that particular theoretical line. For Harvey, on the other hand, imperialism operates through 2 logics: the logic of capital, which involves the process of capital accumulation, and the territorial logic of political, diplomatic, and military management of the state. As the capital system experiences crises of overaccumulation due to lack of profitable investment outlets, spatial temporal fixes are required to restore the process of capital accumulation. That's what Harvey said. These solutions include forcing non-capitalist spaces to open up for capital investments, as well as using them as a source of cheap labor and raw materials. The main problem associated with these theories are that, 1, the political and economic belong to 2 different domains, if not completely separated, each with its own logic and dynamics, generating an artificial disconnectedness and false ontological hierarchies. And 2, these theoretical constructions are essentialists. For capital-centric theories, capital is the ultimate essence of social reality. Thus, imperialism is reduced to the economic logic of capital, that is, the accumulation of capital through a variety of mechanisms: labor arbitrage, monopoly rent, unequal exchange, superexploitation, and income deflation. In fact, there's a bargaining body of recent literature dealing with all these mechanisms. Just to mention few of them: Sakope, the well-known book about the Patnaics that was very well discussed in many seminars and journals, the book by Sotelo Valencia that's really interesting about Marini's and the thesis of super-imperialism and super-exploitation, John Smith's imperialism in the 21st century, and more recently, Suwanda's value change, the new economic imperialism. In the same way, for power-centric conceptions, the ultimate essence of imperialism is the power of the hegemonic states. Imperialism is reduced to the strategic needs of the dominant states. These needs can be economic, political, military, or a combination of them. Very interesting work in this particular tradition is Gordon and Weber, the plots of extraction that try to deal with Canadian imperialism in the Americas, mainly in the mining industry. given the shortcomings of conventional theories, I offer in the paper an alternative conceptual framework. The building blocks of this alternative framework are a particular Marxian epistemological position, that's overdetermination, and the concept of class as a theoretical entry point. An overdetermined epistemology implies that all processes comprising a social totality are mutually constitutive. That is, each one process influences all other processes, and each process existence is the effect of all other processes. Marxian theory approached social totality with class as its entry point for theorizing society. But class in this particular framework is not defined in the traditional Marxist sense. Instead, class is defined as the process of production, distribution, and appropriation of surplus labor. The particular Marxian conceptualization can be represented in terms of these class structural equations, but some clarifications are required in order to make sense of this. First, non-class processes here and here are all those aspects of society that are not directly related with the production of surplus labor. The class process is subdivided in the fundamental and the subsumed class process. The former makes reference to the production and appropriation of surplus labor, and the latter refers to the distribution of already appropriated surplus labor and its products. Although related to each other, class process and classes are conceptually different. Classes refer to the grouping of people around that particular position in the class process. The fundamental class process involves two class positions: performers of surplus and extractors of surplus labor. Likewise, there are two class positions associated with the subsumed class processes: the distributors and recipients of surplus labor. Class structural equations can be interpreted as revenue expenditure equations. The left-hand side of each equation, the left-hand side of each equation represent all class and non-class revenues, and the right side represent all class and non-class expenditures that are necessary to secure the reproduction of all revenues in different spatial locations. And that's important because in a globalized system of production that's characterized by the pervasiveness of decentralized networks and global value chains, there is hardly a spatial correspondence between the production and appropriation and distribution of those surpluses. And the indexes I, J, and K capture that particular condition. The inflow of FDI increased dramatically after the economic liberalization of the Peruvian economy during the Fujimori regime in the early 1990s. From experience in net disinvestment in the 1990s, we have a dramatic increase in the FDI in the 2000s, as you can see in the graphs. I'm just going to skip this. If anybody's interested, we could go back in the Q&A section. By 1997, Latin America concentrated 20% of the worldwide exploration budget, as Paul just mentioned. Peru shares reached 50% of this total local expenditure, making the sixth largest recipient of exploration investment in the world. Over the last 3 decades, FDI in mining has represented around 1/5 of the overall FDI in the country. And more importantly, legal amendments, including a new constitution in 1993, were introduced to safeguard the neoliberal reforms. The mining legislation was changed to favor foreign private investment and to limit state participation through public enterprises. Contract laws, also known as legal stability contracts, were introduced to give foreign investors constitutionally protected contracts, granting them excessive long-term benefits ranging from tax stability contracts, special exchange rate and tariff regimes, profit repatriations, and more. Neither Congress nor any other legislative body could modify those contracts. Since the 1990s, every president in office has made FDI, especially extractive capital, the cornerstone of these so-called development strategies. A modernization creed that put foreign capital as the positive subject bringing progress to the country. This consensus has been based on a decent economic performance during the part of the 1990s and more of the 2000s. For the 2000s, according to the official figures, the GDP rate was 6%, a figure twice that of Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole. Inflation was one of the lowest in the region. Poverty dropped 18% between 1997 and 2010, and the balance of trade improved dramatically during this period. Fiscal revenues also improved, and mining accounted for 25% of that fiscal revenue for the 2000-2018 period. These are just humor also capture the best part of the political situation in the country, and this is how the presidents of the last three presidents or face mining in the country. I can get back in the QA questions if anybody's interested again. So the Peruvian miracle, as was called by the Peruvian economists, some become the exemplary of independent technocratic management of the economy, a successful case of market reforms. In actuality, most of this growth was fueled by the favorable international context of historically lowest interest rate and the massive inflow of capitals and the commodity boom. Yet the Peruvian miracle started to show its limits. The rate of growth of GDP plummeted from 8% in 2010 to 2% in 2019. And that was before the COVID pandemic, even though the inflow of FDI during that period was higher than in the previous decades. The neoliberal economic growth has not modified the long-standing structural inequalities of the country. Even the World Bank recognized that the Peruvian miracle was insufficient for changing the structural patterns associated with high levels of poverty, unable to generate new employment and to increase the wage income share. The neoliberal consensus has actively promoted extensive compensatory social programs as long-term strategies to face poverty and inequality. But even this strategy falls short, as public spending on social programs and overall public expenditure is in the lower bound among Latin American countries. Mining claims and concessions have skyrocketed during neoliberalism. It's estimated that almost 40% of Peru's territory is currently under mining claims and concessions, the red points in the map. Two of the regions, Ancash and Cajamarca, where I'm doing my research, had more than 40% of their territory under mining concessions. In a country where 50% of the overall territory is under some type of indigenous communal landholding, and 2/5 of total agricultural lands belong to rural communities, it's hardly surprising that a large percentage of allocated lands for mining concessions are overlapping with lands traditionally occupied by peasant communities, and therefore large social conflicts. The main productive activities of a campesino household of the northern highlands of Peru are farming and grazing. Both activities are based on family labor, which sustain the social reproduction of the household. This is the fundamental class process characterized by its collective appropriation of surpluses, employing unpaid family labor. At the most basic level, this would be represented by this particular class structural equation. In general, most of the output is consumed by the household, and a small part goes to the market for monetary or in-kind exchange with other households inside and outside the community. It's also possible that some individual that occurs some individual appropriation of surpluses. That surplus that are produced by unpaid and paid or higher labor paid in kind. Usually the head of the household decides whether the surplus are allocated to the subsumed class and non-class recipients. Output likewise is consumed, sold in commodity form, and or exchanged for other goods additionally. Peasant households could farm under a sharecropping agreement with a member of the community or rent the land from a landowner. Depending on the type of agreement, peasant households make in-kind or monetary subsumed payments, could be a ground rent to the landowner. The head of the family is usually a member of the Comunidad Campesina. This is important. The communal organization that regulates the social, political, and economic relations within the community and with outside entities. The Comunidad Campesina has the legal right to establish communal enterprises. In these non-capitalist economic units, the surplus is collectively appropriated, production is carried out employing a combination of wage laborers and non-wage laborers, and output is typically sent to the markets for sale. Neoliberal dispossessions and displacements cannot be seen as an isolated process. The radical agrarian reform of the 1960s in the country broke down the exploitative hacienda system and granted land rights to indigenous peasants and communities. However, since the 1990s, this land tenure system has indirectly favored transnational mining corporations in their negotiations with indigenous peasants over lands and mining concessions, facilitating legal dispossessions. The internal socio-political and economic structure of peasant communities also play a role in facilitating land appropriations. For instance, in Ancash, and this is a view of San Marcos, where one of the biggest mines of the country, and in the war, a copper mine, open pit mine, it's located, it's called Antamina. Families living in the valley here, whose main activity was farming, rather than grazing, owned the pastures in the highlands. They have land holdings. Families in the highlands, mainly shepherds, have access to the pasture lands through their networks of kinship and reciprocity with their peasant families in the valley. The mining corporation needed those lands for its operations, so they established negotiations with both the Comunidad Campesina and individual peasants. The power asymmetries during the negotiations and the promise of monetary compensations made it impossible for the peasant families to reject the offer. Families located in the valley decided to sell their lands without consultation or approval from the families of the highlands, who not only use the pastures for grazing, but also have lived there for decades. Historians have pointed out factionalism as a common characteristic of the Peruvian highland politics. The mining corporations took advantage of this and pursued a divide and conquer strategy aimed to gain support for its operations from the community. After the negotiations, the Comunidad Campesina received almost 1 million. Santa Mina was not yet in operation. The transnational mining corporation used the appropriation for surplus value made in different locations around the world to make these subsumed payments here. For the mining corporation, these were necessary allocations to secure its future appropriation of surpluses and rents. Conceptually, this capitalist non-capitalist articulation can be represented by these relationships. There are many other instances of articulation that could be traced back by using the class structural equation that I discussed briefly in my paper. That could be state development programs and corporate social responsibility programs. Once the indigenous peasants were dispossessed from their lands, the transnational mining corporation started an accelerated resettlement program, a process that infected a material and symbolic violence in the community, destroying their historical way of life. The peasant system involved not only monetary transactions, but also transactions based on kinship and reciprocity, which were essential for their social reproduction. I think I'm okay with my time. That is, and if I went so fast, I can clarify some of the points in the Q&A section. These are just the conclusions of my paper. I've developed an alternative for conceptual framework that then I use to explain some of the dynamics between transnational corporations and peasant communities in the Andes of the northern highlands of Peru. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. For right now, we're going to have 5-minute comments for each of the 4 papers. What I would suggest is we have the comments in the order of the presentation of the paper. So first, we will have Abraham and Timothy give a 5-minute comments to Srishti, and then it'll be the reverse. Srishti will make comments to Abraham and Timothy. So I'm going to be, sorry, a hard ass on time so that we have a chance for the audience, which is not only 2 people today. So go ahead, Abraham.
I'm going to be very brief. I shouldn't need the whole 5 minutes. Srishti, I thought it was a very good paper. I really like the way in which you, I can't think of the right word, but the way in which you discuss the different approaches to petty commodity production. I thought was very clever, and I really liked how you, and I think the strongest part of the paper, I don't recall it coming through in the presentation today, but the strongest part of the paper was when you really tied it to India's experience. And I really think going forward, that's what there is to build on, just in the context of when you were discussing the process by which petty commodity production emerged. It seems almost that there's something there to discuss why it emerged at this point in global capitalism. So maybe tying in the issues of foreign direct investment, neo-colonial relations that India has with other countries, to help understand why petty commodity production has emerged. And I think also looking at other developing countries as well, and seeing if similar patterns emerge that had those colonial relations in the past. I will say I'm a little confused by Sanyal's circuit. Maybe it's just my own reading of the circuits of capitalism doesn't seem to mesh very well, just in the context of M prime being greater than M. My reading is that's accumulation surplus production, not so much consumption in that sense, but I get that Sanyal's interpretation, not so much your own. The last thing I would say is I think there's a really important discussion regarding the embeddedness of the economy to be had with the context of petty commodity production. And this idea that the economy and social systems, the social sphere, however you want to call it, can't be disentangled. They can't be separated the way neoclassical economics tries to separate them. And I think when you were talking about petty commodity production, especially the Harris-White version of it, that really started to come through. And I think that'd be an interesting line of research stemming from this. But those are my comments. I thought it was a very good paper on something that I know very little about. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Abraham. So, Srishti, can we have your comments on Timothy and Abraham's paper?
First of all, thank you so much for your comments. Reading your paper, I mean, first of all, really interesting, crisp writing. It's something that's of interest to all of us. We're all living through it. And the kind of transcontinental perspective that you provide, I think that's extremely valuable. I only have a couple of, again, I'm not going to take the entire 5 minutes. I only have a couple of comments / questions, and maybe you can talk about them. First, I understand how you distinguish between ADB and EU on the one hand and AU and OAS on the other. But I thought that, it makes sense on a fundamental level, but the extent of sort of autonomy of action of ADB and EU as well, I thought that there was a vast difference between, just like the 750 billion euros and $20 billion. You know, those were the sort of 750, and $20 billion for perhaps 1/3 of the world's population, right? So I thought that maybe that is also important to highlight, that there is still and you do that, but I think that maybe it can be brought out even more, that there is a vast difference between the financial capabilities of these two bodies. And the second is just a more broader point, which is, so the important point that you make in your conclusion, and it is an important point, which is that neoliberalism has transformed autonomy of action to be autonomy of finance. And that comes through in the paper extremely well. But my only question with that was, is that really unique to neoliberalism though? I mean, I would intuitively, it seems that even in the 50s and 60s, particularly developing countries, action was always tied with ability to finance. So just if you could clarify that a little more, that'd be great. But thank you so much for your paper and presentation. It was really interesting all around.
Thank you.
Okay, so we now turn to Alejandro for comments on my paper.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Paul's paper, it's really interesting paper, and I think it can be situated within the growing body of literature that is coming from scholars working in the radical political economy tradition that has been critical of the development policies implemented by what's so-called progressive governments, or the pink tie, during the last 2 decades. Although Paul goes back to the 1970s and the transition to the neoliberal period, he kind of argues that even the progressive governments are still tied to the extractivist logic, although he really didn't develop that problem. It's developed in the book, but in the chapter, it's a bit not really a more elaborated concept of that particular situation. There's many scholars working in that particular tradition: James Petras, Henry Baltermeyer, John Ross, Maurice Talas-Pamba, Jeffrey Weber, etc., and many others, and which also have informed my own work. And as it was probably not already noticed, Paul's work, which focuses on agribusiness, that for me is the other side of the coin, of extractivism, alongside with mining, have many commonalities and overlappings. His analysis of Brazil and Argentina resemble my own analysis of the Peruvian mining industry. He also discussed mining a little bit in the chapter. Certainly our theoretical frameworks differ in many ways, but our findings and conclusions are very similar, and that's just striking to me, given the difference between the economic levels of developments of Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. Any economic historian will tell you that those were the most developed economies in Latin America, but the resemblance it's striking, at least to me. Paul's paper and presentations were pristine, and I will not restate the main arguments here. So instead, I would just put some general comments and some questions, not to be answered probably. I mean, yeah, but so general questions to discuss, maybe in different spaces or whatever. And one of the things that you just I was wondering, it's the limits of the new developmentalism, or just the continuity of the neoliberal policies, just as a process of deindustrialization and reprimarization. I'm not clear why even progressive governments are tied to this logic. Is this because there's an international division of labor, as in the traditional Marxist argument, or is something else, or is the role of the transnational, international financial institutions, as the World Trade Organizations, the IMF, or the World Bank, that Paul also discussed in his paper, and in the same line, what is the role of or what kind of power has large economies like Brazil and Argentina, in less measure probably, against these international financial institutions? Of course, it's different for small countries like Peru or Chile, that the policies are just imposed, as sometimes, as William Robinson argued, because there is a transnational elite in alliance with domestic elites that are part of the transnational class that just are pushing this particular agenda. And this, take us to more general questions about if the neoliberal globalization is irreversible, or is some kind of a hope, as Samir Amin mentioned, a few years, decades ago, about like this thesis of delinking. And another comment or a question is, when we discuss the current international division of labor, or as Paul says, the particular type of insertion of the world economy of peripheral countries, I think we should emphasize value added or surpluses over the theoretical arguments that favor primary production, or the type of the profile of the country in terms of manufacturing or primary production. Very recently, some scholars like Zach Cope and John Smith have shown that with a bunch of empirical stuff, that what's important really and characterized in peripheral countries is not if they're engaged in manufacturing production, but how they are subordinated to the appropriation of surplus value or surpluses or rents in the war economy. So yeah, the typical example is China is producing a bunch of manufacturing goods, but when you see the global value change, the appropriation of rents and values is happening in the hierarchy of the global change, with the global north appropriating most of the value added that's generated by workers even in China. And that leads me to my last comment and question is, what's the role of China in the global economy? You know, I mean, there's also scholars in Latin America that are very sympathetic of the Chinese-Latin American relationships, or in Africa, the Chinese and African relationships. But there's also, you know, a body of literature that talks about like an emerging imperialist country or a sub-imperialist country. So I think that you know, that argument has to be developed. I'm not saying that Paul has to do it, but you know, it's an important argument that should be tackled. And then that's it. And it was a wonderful paper. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much, Alejandro. Many interesting comments and enough questions for me to go on for a half hour, but we'll hold off from giving our responses till we also have other questions from the audience. Okay, briefly, my comments for Alejandro also, I mean, as we had quite a bit of many aspects in common, an interesting and important topic, looking at the question of extractivism. One of my current papers now is looking at Ecuador, the Amazon, Ecuador, and Brazil, but the role of transnationals, the importance in looking at how these processes take place, not following the certain dogmatic version of the steamroller effect that everything is just transformed immediately. Living 8 years in the Brazilian Amazon clearly gives one a concrete reason to think otherwise. And also the issues of development, which I consider quite important in discussions you made. The role of neoliberalism, beginning with the Fujimori period, which I observed directly, and it was rather depressing seeing how many people were supportive of him, but such is life. But also I strongly support, because of the importance you give to the class analysis and the problems of neoliberalism. Just what is neoliberalism? I don't know about yourselves, but when I'm speaking with my students, no student of mine knows anything but neoliberalism. I fortunately, having benefited from public institutions, universities in the 70s, I do know something different than neoliberalism. Fine, it's the empire, but there's still an importance to recognize how things could be quite different and were different than neoliberalism. But also the importances of inequality and poverty in Peru. Well, not to take up much time, I do have some maybe critical suggestions, maybe more in the organization of the third section. It seems like you're taking on or putting too much in one section. So it could be section 3, 4, 5, because you're dealing with the transnational mining companies. On the other hand, you're looking at the whole issue of impacts of neoliberalism in Peru. And then lastly, looking at the issues of the different peasant communities and their particulars. I'm going to have more of a critical view, which is expected among Marxists, in terms of the theoretical conceptual framework, not each and every aspect. I did my readings about Husserl back in the day. So I guess, I mean, if we were in a in-person setting, we'd probably go out and talk, have a beer, and discuss some of the differences we may have of your, I guess it's your equations of the capitalist sector, the non-capitalist sector. I would just suggest in a cooperative way,
Sure.
is when looking at what you described as the essentialist positioning, you put a lot of different authors in one bag. And so everyone has a serious problem with Frank, but someone like Harvey, and I have my critiques of Harvey, I find it more difficult to accept him as an essentialist. But again, that's something we could debate. I think there's a need to look at it, because you know, the framework, which I think is derived from Resnick Wolf, also can be questioned by others that don't identify with it. I'm sure I'm not the first Marxist that has brought up this topic. But overall, I was pleased to see your work, and we probably have a bit of research agenda in common, in despite of some theoretical differences. Working in the Andean countries myself right now. So without any further ado, I would like to ask the ASA support to allow us to unmute the people, the audience.
Yes, you can. So
Okay.
please hover over the name of the attendee and you will be able to unmute them.
Very good. So what we'll do right now, and we have roughly 25 minutes, is I would suggest we take some questions from the audience, and then when we come to respond, we can also include responses to the questions given to us by fellow panelists. Is that okay, folks? Cool. So I do see a couple written questions, one by Patty Quick. How will the elections in Chile and possibly Lula back in Brazil affect this? I believe she's referring to issues of the problems of deindustrialization, or the problems of the trajectories of development in Latin America. Secondly, her has a question: how might the restructuring of specific mineral importance in the new production systems, example, OF cars, is that electric cars, or there's a term I don't know yet in English, lead to major disruption in the primary producing countries? Okay. Quick offhand, the need for minerals is not going away anytime soon. So, and that's just a quick response. But let's see if there's others. People can ask to be unmuted to give questions. Any of the participants willing to present a question? Perhaps, I assume they're hearing me. Very good. Well, well, if we don't have any other questions, why don't we just give it a round up to this point? For the most part, it's the questions from other panelists. Would you like to have a response, Alejandro?
Sure. Just, I think Patty Quick's question is also interesting, and I would like to just say a few words about this. And I think the problem here is, again, is extractivism, and even progressive governments are still linked to that particular developmentalist strategy. I'm not optimistic that that will change. Chile is, one of the biggest mining producers, in the world. So although there's some state ownership of some of the mining operations, and that changed a little bit the stuff, and Bolivia was doing the same. We have a progressive government also in Peru, although completely unable to do anything due to the very intransigent right-wing opposition. But still, I mean, I wrote an opinion piece right before the elections, and after read the Pedro Castillo's, the current president that represents the coalition of the left, there was a very radical proposal that was called itself the party, a Marxist, a Leninist party. But when you went to the extractive party, which is embracing the extractivist logic and saying that we need the revenues in order to solve the social problems of the country, and again, it's a big problem. I'm not saying that we should give up to the production of mining commodities, but I think it's problematic in terms of going back to the industrialization or promoting industrial policies in the country.
I'm just going to quickly respond to this in the same area. Yeah, I agree with what Alejandro said. We're not going to have a sudden shift away from minerals. Even, no matter how wonderful it was to listen to Boric's acceptance speech, he's up against a lot of opposition, and mining is so well established in Chile. But in anywhere, for me, there needs to be a push for more democratic discussion of what are the pros and cons, what's the balance sheet of mining. Yes, it generates foreign reserves, but where's that foreign reserves, where are they going? How much gets to the public in a given community besides a little hospital and school they throw in? We have to look at that in a serious way. What are the negatives? And we're not using the wonderful euphemistic economic term externality. That's a term of ignorance. It's not externality. You either have a polluted river or you have people with cancer. That's the externalities we're talking about. But there's a need to look at what are the environmental impacts and what are the alternatives. But in all of this, it's what I think you were sort of alluding to in the questions to me, Alejandro, is the role of the domination of transnationals. They dictate to not just your conservative or your centrist, but to your progressive governments, what's going to be feasible. They dictate. When they sit down at the table with an Argentina, Brazil, it's like China sitting down with Honduras. It's not a cat in the room, it's a tiger. It's a tiger that will dictate what is going to take place. And the same thing with transnational. So in this regard, I see the role of the WTO as huge. And I would advocate any progressive politician should be advocating for an exit of a bloc of 20 to 30 countries from the WTO. 1 or 2 countries, no, it's suicide, economic suicide. You've got to have a bloc like the good old group of 77, which is now, I don't know, 135. But you need to have a bloc of countries demand to either change the WTO rules or get out, because it's not about the development of the countries. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Who would like to speak in response to the questions within the panel? I don't yet see any other questions, but maybe they'll become inspired. Whichever one. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really have answers, but I mean, I do think that these are all, so your first sort of comment was on identifying why petty commodity production sort of becomes this numerically dominant thing at the time that it does. And I think that that's super important. That's something that Bernstein and Sanyal sort of try to answer in their sort of, fragmented ways. But I do think that the response is within the trajectory of, legacy of colonialism, confronting developed countries at the time of independence, so having a completely different sort of topography as compared to early industrializers. Also topography of how much the state can do, which is also shaped by geopolitics and all of that. Then also the trajectory of capitalism itself, as with more and more capital intensive techniques of production, which just generally the tendency, the declining tendency of declining ability to absorb surplus populations. So it's and that at then the 70s and the switch in the role of the state and decline of state-led industrialization. I think that's sort of where, but I do agree with you that that's a really important part of the story that needs to be upfront. And given how broad this story is, then there is also more potential to cross-country comparison, which you mentioned very rightly. Like I completely agree that this is very India-specific right now, but perhaps to compare it with some other countries, maybe somewhere like Turkey, maybe, I don't know. Just like there is a number of countries which have high levels of informality. It'd be interesting to see for sure. What you said about the embeddedness of the economy, that is something I had not thought about so much, but I think that fits so well with just the larger sort of project of, going behind the abstractions a little bit and actually looking at how capitalism operates in real world capitalism, as Bernstein calls it. And so I think that you're completely on the money on that. And it's making me think of how I can maybe incorporate in this paper. But yeah, thank you so much for your comments. And I think all of these are definitely things that I'm going to keep in mind as I move this research forward.
And for, same back to you. Thank you for your comments on ours. Just to discuss a little bit about, I'll start with the second one, regarding whether it's unique to neoliberalism, that autonomy of action is autonomy of finance. There are a couple things that I don't think they came out in the paper as well, just given the space constraints that we're working within. But in the context, and I'll speak more so with just focusing on the Asia Development Bank, for example, early in the Asia Development Bank's history, there were a lot more direct action. There's a lot more of lending directly to the state, a lot more of we're going to focus really on just the direct action rather than going through a third party or an intermediary. Starting in the 80s, I want to say, I don't have the history open in front of me. Starting in the 80s, there was a lot more of an emphasis on public-private partnerships, a lot more on how do we, issue money at the top and hope it trickles down into the rest of the economy. So when we talk about autonomy of action being autonomy of finance, I think one of the things that Tim and I need to do when we go back to the paper and edit is really make sure that that becomes more clear, is that the way in which the finance is being provided has changed a bit, in that it's not so much, here's, you could think of it, at least in the United States with the direct payments to individuals, that you could say, okay, well, there's autonomy of finance there, the ability to just give money to people who need it. But that's very rare. Again, in the US, quantitative easing is the way in which policy is done. We pump banks full of reserves and just hope that they lend it out and hope that they find their way into productive areas and employment falls. So I think one of the things that we should do then is that we need to do is really make that clear, and that the way in which the financing is coming has changed. And that is what has led to the entrenchment of banks and financial institutions kind of at the center of crisis management. And then regarding the vast differences, that's a really good point. And it's one I think that seems very obvious now that you've pointed it out that we need to go and take a look at. I will say, at least in the context of Bauer and Egge's paper, when they talk about bureaucratic autonomy, and Tim, please correct me if I'm wrong here, when they talk about bureaucratic autonomy and autonomy of action, it's the actual scope isn't as important. It's more the can they actually do the things they want to do. So whether it's spend $750 billion or $1 billion, that's the actual scope isn't as important so much as, well, could they do it if they wanted to do it? So again, maybe we'll go back and make sure that that becomes more clear when we're talking about it. So thank you for those two comments. They're both really important things that we need to incorporate to make sure that what we're trying to say comes through. So thank you.
Do you have anything to add, Timothy?
I just want to say thank you. Those are great comments. If I said something, they just kind of repeat what Avi would say more or less. So I was happy to talk about it more, but I want to see if there's more questions from the.
Okay, so I've tried to make it more open for the audience to talk. Any questions? I thought there was someone about to present. It's quite strange that, well, it reminds me of some of my classes, but I tend to have always some students have their camera on. Any questions?
It's the last session blues.
That's right. Although it's not quite the same when it's all virtual. It's not like you've been at the hotel. We went out last night, and et cetera, et cetera. It's, it's a Sunday. All right. Well, then I'm just going to respond to a couple of things that Alejandro mentioned. I think it's this issue of neo-developmentalism, which was sort of coined at a time. It's sort of an idea of it's trying to be different than ISI, where you use, protection and subsidies to promote your industry and be able to have a chance to compete. Because the differences in productivity between even a country like Brazil and South Korea is huge. Now you get a couple odd cases, like they have Embraer, which is military airplanes originally, which is able to compete worldwide, but it's quite difficult, given the advances in technology, to have that capacity. And so I guess you mentioned Samir Amin and delinking. I mean, the delinking would only make sense if you have a block of countries working well together. If you had, like a Mercosur being all of South America, then you've got a shot. But at the same time, US, China, others are going to do their best to undermine the functioning of Mercosur, right? So that's a real big problem. But I mean, without having greater control, as you said, it's an issue of surplus value distribution. Lastly, the role of China in the global economy. I mean, in some sense, China has the role that was England in the original Industrial Revolution, as had US post World War II. They're the dominant economy. There are higher levels of productivity with differences, but they have a major demand for primary products, which is always going to be the case. At the same time, they're taking particular stances, or projects such as the Road and Belt Initiative. And you're going to start to have what I think is a China debt problem. Well, not just China's debt, the debt with countries like, was it Malaysia today? Some country just made a request to reduce their debt with China. I'm spacing it out, but anyway, that's going to be an increasing issue. But I do agree, there's a real concern. I don't know if you're familiar with Ariel Slipak, Alejandro, who's done work on the degree to which China is the #1 or second trading partner for exports and imports with almost every country in Latin America. Now, I mean, Africa is also very high as well, but it's not small potatoes. And to understand that, what one would say, what was the US doing? But I think that's where a transnational capitalist class allows one to explain it. It's not like the US is suffering by having increased trade between Latin American countries and China. There's a chunk that are benefiting from that. So anyway, we do have a hand up. Lane, we turn over the virtual mic to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you in the panel for really presenting, some introduction or overview of the crucial issues in developing countries. It really is very hard in the United States to keep track of, the issues and the analysis. And maybe my question is, do you have any suggestions? I mean, key websites or journals to read? It's just weird. I mean, the nice thing about this panel is I get to understand a bit about Latin America and elsewhere, which I don't really understand very much anymore.
Anyway, just a quick thing is there's a lack of the old Guardian. It was a weekly newspaper in the States of a left perspective that kept you informed about any country in the world over a period of a month. Sounds strange, probably most of you haven't ever heard of it, but the lack of, I think, quality, a place where you have a combination of a few different views, but covering the world globally is sorely lacking. Yeah, we all have to tap Al Jazeera, or maybe we know French and Le Monde and a number of different newspapers, but there's a lack of, I would say, a centralized progressive source of news. Now, some are going to argue for Telesur, but if you know the details of countries in Telesur, they might be great for the analysis of the Arab world, but they often are just going to be kowtowing to a Daniel Ortega or a Correa or whatever progressive that they'll just put the blinders on in terms of having a critical analysis. Anyway, that's my quick comment. Maybe Alejandro or Sirishti has a couple suggestions, comments.
For India, I mean, just very quickly, there is an online, it's a news forum. They also do print. called NewsClick, which is quite reliable usually. So if I ever have to recommend anything coming out of India, that's what I would do. In terms of scholarly work, the Economic and Political Weekly has historically been a solid publication which frequently publishes sort of Marxist contributions.
Economic and Political
Weekly, EPW. Yeah, it's available on JSTOR. And it is becoming less economic increasingly. Earlier, it used to really be the place where you would read, good Marxist economics analysis. That's not the case so much anymore, but still pretty much the place where you would go for the cutting edge heterodox research.
Yeah, it's just the Political and Economic Weekly. It's really good, and usually, academic journals, they have this lag between what happened and the period of publication. But with that journal, it's fast. And there's a really interesting Marxian discussion of the global South, although focused mostly in India, but it's a nice outlet. I will also mention an academic journal, the Latin American Perspectives. That's it's good, and change it over the last years, but still very interesting stuff. In terms of media, I would say the Tricontinental .org. They have some good stuff, and that's it. I remember, if you read Spanish, maybe there's now Jacobin Latin America. It's publishing some good pieces recently, and rebellion.org too, but have to be cautious there with stuff that is there. But it's also in Spanish. So,
well, thank you. I don't think there's any other questions at this point, unless someone gets inspired. I just want to say one thing. In the area of mining, there's actually more potential of global resistance in many sectors, because it's not like if you're producing textiles, which is often the case, they form a union and they jump countries. They leave Honduras, they go to El Salvador. But when you're extracting minerals, you've got to get that mine is there. It's in a physical, specific place, right? And so if there is serious organizing and resistance at that place, then you've got to choose to either leave or take a loss. There's even in management journals about mining, they look at the question of resistance. It's become on their radar, big time. A friend of mine, William Sacher, is French, but he's been doing work on mining in Latin America for a couple decades. In fact, his book in Canada, it's a big plus, was banned. You're doing something right when your book is banned in Canada. There's the issue is that many of these companies are actually more vulnerable than other sectors. If there were a sufficiently organized global anti-mining or challenging mining, we're not going to end mining, but challenging it where there's serious environmental destruction, not to mention dispossession of people. Here in Ecuador, they used bulldozers to wipe people out in their houses. This is under a progressive government, Korea, but it still happens today. So, but if there were more resistance in a global setting, I think mining has a certain vulnerability. Anyway, to be followed. Well, I want to thank all of the participants, the panelists, as well as the audience for an interesting last session to end this ASSA, perhaps the last one of the virtual variety. Who knows how many other variants of COVID we'll be experiencing in coming months, but we'll try to be positive. So without any other question or final comment, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. And
Cheers.
take care.
Let's
Thank
be in
you.
touch. Alejandro.
Sure.
Ciao.
I'm going to shoot you an email.